there is a conversation going on at the global level about the role of what are called middle powers. Now, these middle powers seem to have acquired more importance in today's geopolitical context. So the question really is, who are they? Why do they wield influence? What are their attributes that enable them to shape or at least influence global geopolitics? So I think one should start by saying that the idea or the notion of middle powers has been around for a long time, but it has acquired greater salience because of the features of the global environment today, which are increasing multipolarity, which is global power is being dispersed across the world. And of course, we see a defining reality of the global landscape, which is the US-China standoff or the US-China confrontation. So there is really no definition of what constitutes a middle power. There is quite a lot of this, but there is general agreement that middle powers are those countries that have certain attributes which range from muscle, regional weight, soft power, diplomatic conduct, and of course, their diplomatic activism. Demographic characteristics also count, but they're not enough on their own. So, these attributes give these middle powers sufficient leverage to build multiple chips and, of course, to influence. Now, many countries belong to this group of middle powers. They are both in the global south as well as amongst developing countries. For example, Germany, Japan, Canada, and then Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and so on. Now, the question is Pakistan also a middle power? Well, yes, it is in many respects. But because of its economic weakness, its international influence, its global influence has diminished and is now rather limited. So really, when one looks at these middle powers, I think one of the things that strikes one is that they're able to play off the Sino-US confrontation by playing one off against the other. So in other words, this is very unlike the Cold War, when there was a very tight bipolarity and countries had to choose between the two blocs. Today, because this bipolarity is not so tight in the world is not strictly divided between these two powers, that gives space to middle powers to play one off the other. They seek good relations with both global powers. Now, we've seen recent developments as, for example, the BRICS summit, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa. That also renewed international focus and attention on the role of middle powers, because many of the countries that were admitted to the grouping called BRICS are actually middle powers. And if we look at examples of specific examples of middle powers, I think a good example is provided by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has actually been playing a growing, an increasing global role because it has pursued a new foreign policy direction and raised its diplomatic game. And I think if you look at the way that its rapprochement with Iran, which was brokered, as you know, by China, that has really increased its leverage with Washington. In fact, this development so alarmed the Biden administration that it came up with plans, or at least it began to hasten plans to pursue a grand bargain in the Middle East, which is basically involving Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel in return for a mutual security pact with Washington. Of course, the Saudis have made other demands as well. Now, whether or not this big deal materializes, what it does underline is that Saudi Arabia has played a very deft game in managing to position itself between the two superpowers and therefore wield influence with both. And more recently, at the G20 summit, or at the sidelines of the G20 summit, Saudi Arabia signed on to this project which is, of course, US devised and US backed, with India, of course, also a part of it, to connect India to the Middle East by an economic corridor. Now, again, one can see that the Saudis building good relations and, in fact, very strong economic relations with China, but at the same time, using its leverage with the United States to secure other foreign policy objectives. Another very good example of a country that has played a very deft middle power diplomatic game is Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey has good relations with both the United States and Russia. In fact, it tried to mediate between Russia and Ukraine once the war in Ukraine began. And it brokered the famous Black Sea grain deal between them, which allowed safe passage for shipment of grain from Ukraine, which is, as you know, a big exporter through the Black Sea. So, we've seen Ankara also using its leverage over the issue of NATO expansion to secure concessions from the United States and the European Union, and yet follow an independent path in its foreign policy.